Hi there. Welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. This is a little bit of a special bonus episode, which we're putting out outside of our usual fortnightly publishing schedule, because we wanted to talk about something that happened a week ago, which was the so-called debate of the century between Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek. And we are very happy to welcome back onto the podcast Angela Nagle to try to tease out what the import of this debate was. A quick announcement before we get started, and it's a bit of a sad one. Our friend Ben Fogel, who's been part of Alpha Bunga Bunga for the past year, is unfortunately leaving the podcast. He's busy with his PhD and other writing and editorial projects, so is no longer going to be involved in producing and hosting Alpha Bunga Bunga. But of course, we'd like to say cheers, Ben, for all your contributions over the past year, and good luck. You will be hearing Ben one more time on the podcast next week in an episode with Ken and Malik on identity and migration, which we recorded a little while back, but will only be coming out next week. All right, on with the show. Very warm welcome, and a welcome back actually to Angela Nagle, who was first on the podcast, I think, about a year and a half ago. And we really have been wanting to have her back much earlier than this, but now she's here, and we're going to talk about Peterson versus Zizek. Hi, Angela. How's it going?
Hi. How's it going?
Very well. Actually, kind of excited to talk about this thing that was billed as the debate of the century, which, I mean, I guess you can get away with it because the century is quite young. Otherwise, it'd be pretty disappointing, I think.
That's true.
It's not of the debate of the last 100 years, but just merely the last 18 and a half. So I think we're okay. I guess everybody who's listening to this has watched the debate, or is at least familiar with enough of it and what happened and who Zizek and Peterson are, that I don't have to explain all of it. But I mean, I guess what can we say about it? That it was ostensibly a debate between left and right, between maybe supposedly the current embodiment of what the right looks like and maybe what the left looks like, though that's debatable. And I think, much of the commentary is picked up on, they both have ostensibly a mutual enemy in the kind of postmodern liberal left or radical liberalism, or however you wish to characterize that sort of body of thought, which is very prevalent today. But it also was meant to be about happiness, and I think that ended up maybe being one of the less interesting aspects of the debate. But let's actually get into that before I actually ask Angela what she's been up to. So what have you been up to recently?
I've kind of taken a couple of months off of, I haven't actually published anything in a couple of months, but I'm working on a couple of projects, kind of essay pieces. One is about beauty as a public good. The other one is about internal, intra-elite class conflict, essentially. But I won't give too much away about those. You'll have to see them when they come out.
Sounds really good. So before we get into talking about the actual content of what they talked about and the Zizek-Peterson debate, just before we dialed you up, Angela, we were talking about historical comparisons and precursors. George came up with some. Alex and I came up with some, but we're not sure if there's anyone that really fits, because the ones we came up with, and maybe you have some others in mind, the only two that we could think of basically were Foucault and Chomsky, which was set up less as a confrontation and more as a kind of dialogue, I guess. And then also obviously Gore Vidal and William Buckley, who are again, that was more confrontational, but they were public intellectuals rather than standing, I guess, for academic traditions or relating to the academy either. So there aren't easy analogues for this kind of particular kind of debate between figures like this.
Yeah, well, because Buckley was one of the conservatives who really did go and debate a lot of people, when I was thinking of kind of good debates of the past, he kept being the one side of all of them. So Jermaine Greer debated him once. Is really good. I don't think there's any. I've never seen any video footage of it, but you can. The audio is up on YouTube somewhere. And I was also thinking of Baldwin versus Buckley was another good one. But those were, and then of course there was Greer versus Mailer, which was also very good. But those were direct conflict, and they were also much more clear. It was very, it was confrontational, and it was very clear what both sides were arguing for. And they were kind of enemies in a way. Whereas I think one of the reasons this was a bit more confused is that both of them have a kind of both of them have ended up, I guess, with a kind of bee in their bonnet about contemporary identity politics, if you like, and because that it shapes so much of all the debates that go on now. It seemed like that is what they both find themselves in conflict with most of the time, even though what they're supposed to be representing in the debate is like a capitalism versus communism kind of thing. And it didn't really end up being that debate.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, and it's really useful to be reminded of the debates with Germaine Greer and the fact, like you say, that Buckley did these other debates as well. I was thinking, I mean, just to, again, as partly by way of framing the context of the debate, something that's been intriguing to me is trying to explain Peterson's appeal, because it really isn't. He doesn't speak to me, and trying to figure out what it is about him that appeals to a particular generation. Because I know, I mean, some students who are engaged and switched on, some have mentioned to me that they quite like Peterson or are intrigued by him or interested by him, which I'm always surprised by, because these are the good students. And it seems to me so obvious, and they're men. And it seems to me so obvious that a kind of, or mystifying as to why an intellectual nullity like Peterson would have any appeal. And the only thing, or the thing that I've come up with, I think, is it's about authority. I think it's because he embodies a kind of, I want to say patriarchal, but I don't mean it in the grand feminist sense of patriarchal. I just mean like he's your dad. He's kind of a middle-aged or a more older gentleman who has he's a professional figure with some standing, and he has authority. And we don't have many male figures of authority in contemporary society. And I think it's this that explains his, make your bed, stand up straight, get a job, have a meaningful relationship. I think that's why he appeals to a certain kind of young man, because there are no male authority figures that are willing to just give very basic messages.
And he wears a suit as well.
Well, I think there's something else if I can jump in. I mean, this was my first ever prolonged exposure to Jordan Peterson. I kind of one of those dickheads who's like, I've never seen Star Wars, and like everyone was talking about Peterson, I'm not watching Peterson. So this is my first Peterson moment.
Have you really never seen Star Wars?
I saw the very first, the initial very first one that ever came out, and I didn't like it, and I don't like all the rest of it, and I hate that people always talk about it.
So Peterson is to you what Marx is to Peterson.
Right, but I feel like I'm avoiding something which is much more avoidable than having some knowledge of Marxism, even the most basic. I mean, obviously it was striking that how unwell read, is that the thing? Whatever, how badly read he was on Marxism. But we'll come on to that. I think there's something else about his appeal. I totally agree with Phil's take that, he represents an authority figure. But I mean, obviously, intellectually, it's fairly shallow. It's quite banal what he says. But for those people who probably don't read a lot of books, he does act as a bit of a one-stop shop. He provides a philosophical framework, a quite intuitive and easily graspable one, which is like evolutionary psychology, that, people act the way they do because they've always acted this way for millennia, because people are, selfish, defensive, have group mentality, and whatever. All that kind of thing.
People are lobsters.
People are lobsters, basically. He also offers a political critique and a political standpoint that you can hang your hat on. If you're a little bit annoyed by identity politics and the constant shouting and screaming and bad faith, you can kind of go, okay, well, this provides me an answer to this. And then, of course, there's what Phil said, which is the personal personal psychological orientation and a sort of morality or guide to life, which is, take personal responsibility, man up. He's the daddy that's otherwise absent. And he's not very good at any one of those things. You could find a better evolutionary psychologist to read. You could find a better critic of the liberal left, identity politics, postmodernism, whether a left-wing version or a right-wing version, you take your pick. And you could also find probably a better coach as well. But he provides a one-stop shop providing all three of those. And I guess that might explain his popularity.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely a self-help guru, primarily. Self-help in the kind of female genre of self-help is ubiquitous. But I guess the kind of masculine self-help is always seen as very suspect and tends to come under attack, and then it kind of strengthens itself because of that, because of being attacked in that way. I think, though, his appeal, so some of his appeal comes from that. Also the fact that I guess he filled that space of being a, at the right time of being a vocal critic of kind of campus identity politics, who was willing to go out there and put his face and name to it. And so he was, that's how he got that kind of a cult following. But I think that his the reason that he maybe fills a bigger purpose too is a tension in the kind of attention that exists within liberalism, which is a system that is in a kind of crisis, and he is asserting more of a classical liberalism. Now, some people have said that that's not the case because they want to believe that he's actually, a kind of like a crypto-fascist or something like that, right? That's kind of the way everything is described now. But I do think that is actually legitimate. He is trying to bring the center of politics back towards a kind of classical liberalism. In other words, away from the progressive liberalism that comes from Rousseau. So he would assert, classical liberal values, but also fundamentally believes, as the kind of early modern liberals did, that human nature is not totally malleable. That's one of his central claims.
Yeah, he's a kind of, I thought, a small, I don't know if small c conservative, because that's used to describe people who, want to hold back history. I think his conservatism is a little bit more than that, but he's a kind of, a petty conservative in an age in which liberalism is hegemonic. So, he's a liberal, as you say, in terms of the broadest possible categories, but he's also just kind of a conservative concerned with maintaining a holistic order and making sure that people live moral lives, or helping people live moral lives. And by the end of the debate, when Zizek had completely cucked him, I guess, to use the parlance of the age, he'd completely cucked him, and I almost felt a bit sorry for Peterson. He's not this monster that he's made out to be. He's just kind of like, he's this kind of middle-aged depressive who you're like, yeah, okay, mate. Like, you keep trying to help people to live moral lives. There's a little bit something tragic to him.
Yeah, I almost thought there was something kind of innocent to his line of questioning, right? Because when I saw that he was going to do his bid on the Communist Manifesto, and that he admitted openly that he hadn't read Zizek and that he had only read the Communist Manifesto, just like a tiny pamphlet, there was something almost kind of innocent about that. And also, I thought there was something innocent about the fact that he was saying, well, what would be so strange about asking a Marxist about the Communist Manifesto? Like, isn't this meant to be a central document of the contemporary left? But of course, it's such a mess untangling all of this. But one of the things that made all of this make no sense whatsoever is he's trying to marry this kind of classical liberalism with Cold War anti-communism. And the fundamental mistake there is his mistake in understanding the contemporary American left, or the Anglo-American left, which is itself more a product of anti-communism, or at least anti-Stalinism, than it is of the Communist Manifesto.
So, sorry, Andrew, just to interrupt there. Before we sort of get onto the significance of the debate between the two of them, I guess there's a question: what's your account of why Zizek is so appealing? Because if Peterson's appeal lies partly in the fact that he looks like Pencil Vesta and sounds like Kermit, but he can still become this kind of cultural force. He's a middle-aged depressive, and Zizek is this neurotic, very unhappy figure, just like Peterson is. They're strange. They're debating happiness. What does Zizek represent for the contemporary left?
Well, I think Zizek's appeal is that he is eccentric and funny, but also one thing I think really came across in the debate is he's actually quite a nice person. Like he could have been quite cruel in that debate, right? It would have been very easy for him to just like relentlessly, demolish like everything Peterson said, but he was actually quite generous, and even when, the only bit where he was combative was at the very end when he was kind of saying that this postmodern neo-Marxism you're talking about, doesn't make any sense. Even then, he was saying, "I know what you mean when you say that." You know what I mean? Like he was being quite generous in spirit, and he is a lovable character, and there aren't many of those around, in that world. So I think that's kind of his appeal. And also, he's appealing because he's not, because he also represents a kind of a rejection of the dominant form of what he would call the liberal left. So it's weird because they both have a separate fan base, in part based on this kind of widespread dislike of that style of politics, which otherwise doesn't have much of a voice, which is why, Zizek himself has come under attack a lot, from within the left itself.
Mm.
Well, go ahead.
He does come across as very likable, doesn't he?
Well, there was also Peterson's appreciation of Zizek as a person. I think kind of early on he goes, and I also appreciate that you're quite a character. You have personality, which takes a certain moral courage to be a character today. And it's like, Christ, that's true, isn't it? That's depressing.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to him myself one time, and it's very disarming because he is hilariously funny, and he's not very careful about what he says, which again today, because we're living through this very weird time where kind of one badly phrased sentence can destroy your career instantly. It's funny to have someone who says outrageous things and who isn't very careful about, protecting their, career from these kinds of attacks. But, so for example, when I spoke to him, the first thing he launched into was a series of questions about who's better, Michael Collins or Eamon de Valera, and then he was like, who's better, Joyce or Beckett? And it went on like that. So he had all these questions about all these Irish figures, and which he proceeded to answer himself.
I was literally just about to ask, did he give you then a chance to speak?
No.
Excellent. I wanted to ask, Angela, what you thought was the importance of the debate, if any. And also, I mean, you had mentioned before, when we were chatting before recording, that you thought there was a particularly weird, out-of-place character, or maybe out-of-time character to the debate. So maybe you could explain what you thought about that.
Yeah, well, I think basically this was kind of somewhat clear before, but it became much clearer because of the approach that Peterson took, that he is totally out of time. I mean, he's still fighting the Cold War, and he's talking about he is having this, he's fighting the ghost of Marx, basically. And then his real world point of reference for, Marxism coming to fruition is Joseph Stalin. And, there aren't many Stalinists around today. And, except for sort of strange corners of the internet, I suppose. Certainly in the Anglo-American context. And so it's kind of like, who is he actually arguing with here? So he's having an argument with the kind of left that's long dead. And so that's really why it ended up being quite strange. I think, as I said, he kind of fundamentally, I think, doesn't understand what the left is now.
And it's interesting because he's guilty of exactly what he accuses his opponents, I mean the liberal left, of. So Zizek has, Peterson has this misguided interpretation that Marxism is about this binary competition or struggle to the death, maybe even, between labor and capital, between proletarian and bourgeoisie, and that sort of group that sort of two competing groups facing off against each other is the worst thing you can have in politics. You want a kind of more holistic society of maybe individualist competition, but not group competition. And he sees that the postmodernists, once they felt that the left was losing, that communism was losing, that they then adopted group identities, identity politics, as a way of continuing on this binary struggle. So, you face off the first world against the third world, black versus white, women versus men, etc., etc., etc. I mean, that's a very, very crude reading of what actually happened in the kind of the end of Marxism, basically, and the development of postmodernism. And in some cases very wrong. But Peterson seems to do exactly the same thing, in that he wants to carry on this Cold War, but because there are no Marxists, he has to invent cultural Marxists as the kind of big enemy. So in fact, it's funny that he ends up being guilty of exactly what he accuses, the liberal left of doing. Yeah. Okay. And so his idea that cultural antagonisms, identitarian antagonisms, and so on, have essentially replaced, class, is actually true. And nobody has been better at pointing out the cultural turn than Marxists, right? But his mistake is thinking that somehow you are going to get to communism, or indeed Stalinism, from cultural antagonisms. Right. Like, there's no route. There's no amount of what he calls, let's say, cultural Marxism that is ever going to produce a change in the economy fundamentally, or in the means of production or anything like that. There's no point at which cultural conflicts will suddenly transform the economy. So he shouldn't have any fear. He shouldn't have any fear that cultural Marxism is ever going to turn into Marxism. At best, it creates an oppressive climate, which might be a little bit Stalinist, but that's about as far as it goes. Yeah.
So I had a question here, which might be a little bit not fully formed, but is your sort of reading of this that it comes across as in some ways a little bit old-fashioned, because it's almost in the period of the Cold War, i.e. not just before the end of history, which is the period we are now, but before the end of history. So it comes across as kind of political in one sense, but not really, the debate wasn't really aligned with the sort of political discussions that are live on the ground at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a way of trying to take contemporary conflicts and channel them into something that would make more sense kind of under Reagan or something like that, And I can't help but think, I mean, Peterson has obviously come under a lot of attack and stuff like that, and more than like most people would be willing or able to take. But he has also had some institutional support in the media. Like, so for example, if you look at the quite positive way in which he was, him and the whole intellectual dark web thing was written about in, I think, the New York Times, you know, and also like say Heterodox Academy and those kind of people. Like there is a milieu there of people who do have influence, who broadly speaking, you know, support him and have sort of similar politics to him. But I can't help but think that he's also playing a role within conflicts that are going on in the right, and in the battle for the mainstream political right. The kind of Trump and the populist thing was a genuine shock to the system, and which, you know, the entire liberal kind of, it would be too nice to say intelligentsia, but academic and media class or whatever have been going crazy, of course, ever since. And I think the reason for that is because that moment kind of represented a genuine possibility of a change within the right. And he kind of is a reactionary within that context, because he is trying to pull the mainstream right, the establishment right, back to the politics of the Cold War. And you see this in like TPUSA and those kinds of things, which want to talk about the stuff that preoccupied the mainstream right before Trump came along. So it was all about hooray for the free market, kind of neocon foreign policy, that kind of stuff. And so I see him as playing a role as an internal reactionary within the right, kind of almost against that populist wave, which was you know, which was not so religious in its view of the free market and things like that.
So one of the kind of reads of the whole debate and how it worked out was obviously a psychoanalytical one, that Zizek is kind of doing some psychoanalysis on Peterson, or allowing Peterson to work through this particular obsession that he has with cultural Marxism, that this is his fetish object. How do you do you think this is right? What, I mean, why is it that people are obsessed with cultural Marxism? I think everyone in this discussion would be very happy if cultural Marxism was, whatever that means, were a really dominant force in American politics. But it really isn't, is it?
I think actually that what would have been an interesting debate is if they made it about happiness or something like that, and just got rid of the Cold War communism versus capitalism thing, and actually just had a discussion about psychoanalysis. Because that's really what both of them are maybe most interesting and expert on. Jung in the case of Peterson, Lacan in the case of Zizek. If they had a discussion just about that actually might have been more interesting, but they kind of tried to do both at the same time, which didn't make any sense. And
they did sort of get there towards the end. And actually, on the psychoanalysis point, I thought one of the most interesting responses to it is something which just come out, which is Doug Lain at Zero Books did a little video on his take on it. I thought it was an interesting interpretation, which is that Zizek's approach to the whole thing, especially when it became obvious that Peterson was absolutely his intellectual inferior and that there wasn't going to be a real debate about whatever, capitalism versus socialism or anything like that, but that he basically assumed leadership of it, almost like an analyst would with regard to his patient, and kind of tried to psychoanalyze Peterson to get him to give up his fetish object of the cultural Marxists. That, you know, if you give up your fetish object of the cultural Marxists, you then have to examine your own presuppositions. What is actually driving you? And, you know, Zizek uses the example of the, taken from Lacan, of the jealous husband, that even if it proves true that everything that the husband suspects of the cheating wife is actually true, that is, she is cheating on him, his jealousy is still pathological, right? And it's taken, he uses that as a sort of metaphor to examine, why if someone on the right is completely obsessed with cultural Marxism, they need cultural Marxism to exist for them to find their feet in society and find their feet in politics. And one could say the same about a lot of the left as well, which it needs the enemy of rising fascism or imminent fascism or whatever to find grounding in politics. And without that, suddenly they're a little bit at sea and have to look within, as it were, within the left and examine, why the left isn't winning. And I thought that was a good take. And I think I think he achieves that. Or maybe that's a question. Do you think he achieves that in terms of psychoanalyzing Peterson?
I'm not sure. I mean, it certainly made Peterson, pause and perhaps even self-doubt a little bit. I mean, the rare occasions where something, where they ended up actually discussing anything rooted in materialism, where Zizek was saying, like, how do you solve the problems of the ocean? Peterson actually had to.
That just sounds fun, yeah.
Had to admit that actually, that's not something that a company with the profit motive is going to ever do. So on the rare occasion where, a genuine materialist question was posed, he kind of conceded straight away. But I think it is true that was a good approach in the sense that for Peterson, cultural Marxism is the fetish object, but also it is so because it allows him to believe that the cultural movement, if you like, or the form that the left takes, at least in academia and the media and stuff like that, that is rooted in Marxism. Like, he has to believe that, and when it was examined, it didn't really make much sense. But for him, he has to believe that, because then you can return to a safer ground in which the liberal system, which is in crisis, can reassert itself and can make sense again, because it has this comforting old enemy of the Cold War, when in actual fact it doesn't.
Right, and maybe we should turn this same lens onto Zizek and ask, is he still relevant? I mean, that's maybe too provocative a way to put it. But maybe I think Phil maybe has a point or a question on this more specifically.
Well, only to say, I suppose, it's hard to think of somebody else who would stand in on the platform against Peterson, because as we've already said, there are no cultural Marxists. There are people who Peterson describes as cultural Marxists, but it doesn't actually exist. We know what he means, but it's not an actual kind of coherent category. And the people who he opposes wouldn't debate with him because they would all no platform him, right?
Yeah.
Or deplatform him, or they wouldn't be coherent. So it's hard to think of anybody else. I think also Zizek, he's somebody who he doesn't just subsist off provocations and provocations and these kinds of interventions. He also has kind of a solid long list of philosophical, psychoanalytic publications, weighty tomes and all that. And I guess the question is how many more of those, or how many, if he's got more of that left in him.
He probably doesn't have that much more left in him. He is he's an old man, but it's true. It's hard to think who a younger version of him would be, or even who else could have done that, because, as you say, they would have all not been willing to share a platform with Peterson. And the two things are part of the same problem. The fact that they would be unwilling to share a platform with Peterson is also why they will never be like Zizek, right? Because dealing with difficult ideas is what created Zizek, you know. I mean, my real fear is that, you know, even if you look at some of the responses to the debate, like from writers on the left, like some of them were just like needlessly personally vicious about Zizek himself, saying like, you know, it's so unnecessary. And I just thought, like, this is exactly the problem. You know, I mean, you can character assassinate him all you like, but we're not going to replace him. We're not going to replace Barbara Ehrenreich. We're probably not going to replace Bernie Sanders. You know, there is this whole older generation of the left that, you know, I don't see a younger version coming up behind them, in part because
they have nothing to say. That's why.
Well, yes, but the thing that both Zizek and Peterson are being critical of, the culture that they're both trying to describe in their different ways, doesn't really have a name. But we all know what it is. That's why Zizek said, "I know what you mean." That culture has fostered a situation where, you know, we're just not going to have those kinds of interesting people emerging. They will be shot down immediately. I mean, imagine, for example, a young Zizek trying to enter like academia now. It just wouldn't be allowed. And he would be cancelled immediately. So I wish that would cause people. I wish people would pause and like think about the seriousness of that we're not going to actually be even producing intellectuals anymore, because the left is just not allowing people to put a foot wrong on any, and it's all on cultural questions. You know, you can debate economic questions all over the place. You can have all kinds of different and eccentric kind of views when it comes to that. But it's really the primarily cultural battlefield of liberalism, where everyone has to stay within ever narrowing kind of confines.
It's an interesting point about young Zizek, because famously from his own biography and discussion, when he talks about his own background, famously he was, because he was classed as a dissident in Yugoslavia in the 1980s and 1970s, he was famously, what they did was the Yugoslav establishment they wouldn't allow you to teach. So they gave him time to do research. They kind of gave him time to be at an institute, and they allowed him to travel abroad. And that was how he got to Paris and studied under, connected with Jacques Lacan and studied under Jacques Lacan's followers. But he wasn't allowed to teach students. So he could have no influence over students, but had time to actually think. So I don't know how does I guess you're not allowed to do research, you know, in the hegemony of the cultural left as it stands in the Western Academy. You're not allowed to do research, and you're not allowed to teach, and you're also not allowed to stand. You're not allowed to be on a platform, because then you'll be deplatformed. So you're not even invited to university to talk. So I guess, yeah, basically you're completely shut out. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, that was another funny irony of this debate, because Peterson kind of sees himself as like, a Cold War anti-communist, and he references the kind of Russian dissidents, but Zizek really was one, you know, and he's almost like a dissident on both sides.
Yeah, that's right.
He's ended up being a dissident under both systems.
So I wanted to just refer a little bit to some criticisms which were made of Zizek, which is that he doesn't chart a political way forward. And I guess one could even ask whether he is really a political thinker. That's not a criticism, it's just an evaluation of his thought. And for me, like, Zizek is very important. I mean, just in terms of what I grew up reading and thinking about. And he was the most brilliant analyst of post history, and that strange period in which ideology was denied, and yet he insisted those who most deny ideology are the most ideological themselves. And I wonder if we're entering, into a more tumultuous period where whether politics has come back or not is an open question, but certainly the assumption of a eternal present has maybe drifted away a little bit. I mean, we're not in the post-Cold War period anymore, and I just wonder whether Zizek is still, I don't want to say relevant, because that's not the right way to put it. I wonder whether Zizek still has the same sharpness. And I think, again, to refer to a point someone else made, which is, if Zizek didn't have the liberal left as an object of opposition, whether it's in his criticisms of multiculturalism or environmentalism or identity politics, if he didn't have that object to criticize, what would he then do? If he suddenly had to engage politically, what would his response be? And that's quite a difficult thing to imagine, and I guess it's one of the reasons why he has been accused of liberal pessimism, because he doesn't seem to chart a way forward. I think there was this Jacobin piece about it, which I don't agree with a lot of it, because I think it wasn't intellectually generous enough to Zizek and what Zizek was actually attempting to do. But the one point they do raise is that he defended, for example, universal healthcare, the fight for Medicare for all in the US, and then he frames it precisely in terms of freedom. And I think that's quite important, and Zizek does gesture at that at least. But there isn't a huge amount of political pointing the way forward from him. Is that a problem, do you think, Angela?
Yeah, but it's not a problem. I mean, I think he was just being very honest. I think I think what he probably feels right now is that, some kind of a social democracy, a very, which in many cases is just trying to undo some of the damage done during the kind of Reagan and Thatcher era. In many ways it's like a return to an older form of politics. But I think that, that seems to be the only game in town right now. And I think that he accepts that, but he also knows that isn't Marxist. Like, that's not going to fundamentally transform the global economy. And that he doesn't see he doesn't see anything emerging in the world right now that is going to do that. And I think that's just his honest view of, he's not necessarily, like, I guess there comes a point at which you have to not just say what you think ought to be the case, but what actually is and what is likely to be the case. And I think he's just being honest about the fact that he doesn't see, a global, fundamental transformation of capitalism emerging.
Yeah, and I mean that thing about pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will is such a cliche, but it still remains valid in that, despite a couple of glimmers of hope in recent years, we still live in a situation which is really quite desperate in terms of the possibilities for social transformation. And I think facing that honestly and coldly is still the important task today. I don't think we can get away from that. And obviously that doesn't mean that one should be depressive in the sense of being wrapped up in one's own concerns and being unable to act in the world. On the contrary, but it does mean that you have to be aware of what the limitations are today and where we actually stand.
Yeah, and I think also like Zizek is always kind of doing two things at once, and so I think that his pessimism should be read in a more complex way, as you say. Like, sometimes I think a very stark statement of pessimism can be the jolt that you need, that's actually much more powerful than pretending, we're going to transform the world and it's just around the corner. That can actually be ultimately a pacifying thing to say.
Yeah.
I think also when people who are on the radical left get a bit older, I do think they tire of being part of a fantasy, basically, like a collective fantasy that, like, we're just about to win, that kind of thing. I think that tends to grate on. I always think of this really funny interview that Norman Finkelstein did with, I actually don't know who the interviewer was, but I know that his name was Frank, because he kept saying, Frank, we have to be, and he did.
And he wants to say, like, you want to be frank.
We have to be frank. Yeah, he's saying Frank. I used to be a Maoist, and we were always saying we were just about to win. Our movement is getting stronger, and now I'm an old man. I'm tired of cults. I'm tired of being always taking part in this kind of collective fantasy. We have to be realistic about the real possibilities that are before us, and so I mean, there is a point at which, if you've been hearing this your entire life, that you have to just say, I'm just going to be real. I'm just going to be realistic in how I describe the world and like what real, political opportunities there are on the horizon, instead of being a utopian and just saying this is how the world ought to be. So I think that, there's definitely a role for that kind of pessimism. And I think it might actually be the thing that people need to hear maybe a little bit more at times.
Absolutely. Well, that's Angela Nagle being patronizing to people, making yet more friends. Angela, thank you very much. Really enjoyed talking Zizek versus Peterson, various other things over with you. We have to have you back on again. Cheers.
Were you actually there for the debate, or did you watch it on?
I was watching Amber.
Yeah. So you watched it. With some popcorn and.
Yes. Yeah.
That sounds like fun.
I mean, it was unfortunately on Passover evening, and I had family commitments consequently. I feel like it was quite anti-Semitic for them to schedule it on that day. How many Jewish intellectuals are watching this? Come on!
They missed the trick of kind of like who won, who was like. There must have been a way to quantify or like.
I mean, it was very clear. I think the consensus was the Zizek one, right? There was all the memes of him like boiling lobster and all that.
No, and also I think, I mean, this is a point that Amber made, I think, on Red Scare, that the Reddit, like on Reddit, there were like Reddit/Jordan Peterson or whatever. There are people on there like, wow, that Zizek guy is pretty good. I'm going to check him out. Or people like, wow, Peterson was really intellectually unprepared. Like, that's quite disappointing. I'm going to check out Zizek. It's like, it just goes to show you go in and you argue and you put in a good argument. It's actually worth doing rather than kind of fucking no platforming people.
Yeah, that's another thing. I have done a couple of speaking events, and I don't really do debates because they're not really something I'm particularly good at. But when I have, I often have these like young like guys coming up to me afterwards, like 18-ish age. And, they're not fully politically formed. Like, I mean, they're coming into contact with these ideas a lot of the time for the first time. And, but they're in this world where they're kind of listening to people like Peterson and the stuff well to the right of Peterson, we'll just say. But what I found is that they were like sponges. Like, I was talking to them about, different thinkers on the left that have influenced me. They never heard of any of them, and like one of them was like taking them down on his phone. He was like asking me to, I was giving them reading lists, basically, and so they're like very interested. They do, like, a lot of them are just like very interested in being able to have a debate about anything really in a kind of an open way. And they are just being like needlessly vilified and shut down if they put a foot wrong in any direction. And
it's even more than that. I think it's because it's also if there's something about you, and you've got a sense of kind of independence and a desire to very basically control your own life, you're gonna just, if you've got those kinds of instincts, you're gonna be able to smell bullshit, and you're gonna react badly to being told what to think and what to do, and then everyone's gonna say, "Well, you're right wing then," and you're gonna be okay, I'm right wing.
That's me then. Yeah.
Let me go on.
I was looking for an identity. Now I've got one. Yeah.
Yeah, or you start thinking, may as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb.
Exactly. Yeah.
Another thing too is that, and this is something that immediately when I thought of when this thought occurred to me, I thought of the what the Twitter reaction would be to even saying it, which is terrible, is in my head now, which is that I noticed I taught a little bit, not very much, just like adjunct, like temporary stuff. And my, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but my experience of teaching was that I noticed a general difference between boys and girls, which was that a lot of the young men tend to work their way through ideas by first just adopting a really extreme position and arguing it. And they'll have a completely different position a year later. But the way they go through, like, deciding if something is right or not is like testing it out in that way. And so I think that is misinterpreted a lot of the time, or it's not seen as an opportunity for, just like changing people's ideas. I think that young women are much more likely to be cautious about aligning themselves with some kind of obscure ideology or something like that. I think that young men are much more likely to test out ideas in that way by seemingly very confidently and boldly stating a position, when in actual fact they may not really hold it very firmly, and they may be convinced to change their idea very quickly.
Yeah.
But a few months later, they'll be really boldly stating the opposite position to somebody else.
Well, I was once a young man, and
we're all by that reckoning, we're all still young men on this podcast. So that's great. That's great news for us.
You know what I mean? You'll have like a 16-year-old saying, "Well, as a Titoist."
No, I mean, all joking aside, I think you're absolutely right. It is some. I mean, you've described something accurately that I'm aware of, but haven't really processed as such. And seeing it myself in higher education, and also speaking to my own experience. I mean, I vacillated, vacillated is the wrong word, but bounced around between a variety of hard political positions in over the years. I mean, stabilized now, obviously, and now for Bunga Bunga, but before that, definitely. And it's a really interesting observation. And like you say, I can exactly see why you'd be cautious about putting it on Twitter, because it is the kind of point that would attract all the morons in their thousands.
I think you need to remember that there are some people who really want there to be like incipient or kind of proto-fascist and want these kind of young men who are expressing opinions in quite a trying them out sort of way to really be quite far right wing, and those are people whose liberalism needs to be morally kind of verified by these there being a real threat of a fascist menace, whereas I think it is more accurate that a lot of the time it's people trying out ideas by expressing them and then realizing the weaknesses and the contradictions when people push back and say like that's not correct, or even in just expounding them, realizing
I mean it's like a mirror image, right? You have the kind of the Rousseauist progressive liberals using the specter of fascism to self-justify and kind of reinforce their own ideas, and you have the kind of classical liberal wing of liberalism, which we call the right, the mainstream right, using the specter of Stalinism, the left authoritarianism to do exactly the same thing. If we don't stay within the parameters of these kind of, let's say, left-right divisions within liberalism, these sinister forces from outside will emerge. So we must, never budge.
And I mean, there's also we end up creating people create the dystopias that they want, right?
Yeah.
And that those dystopias serve a purpose, and so the incipient fascism is can be a useful one for people, as well as incipient cultural Marxist takeover, for that matter as well.
Yeah.
What a life-affirming note to finish on.
He was absolutely hilarious in it, to be honest. Like he did start off by saying something, as well as the list of questions. He did also say, now, I am, as you can see, I am a man who needs a woman to dominate me.
Oh, brilliant.
By which he meant you have to interrupt me or I'll just keep going. And then I just completely failed to be the woman he wanted me to be.
That's the kinkiest thing you could have done.
I know.